right, next up we have the last Argento film that I watched. Also new to me was Tenebre. This was a lot of fun. Not my favorite. I think I like Cat o' Nine Tails more. Although ironically, when I think back about like just moments from Dario Argento movies, this one actually had more things that I kind of remembered from it. I kept thinking of how, the author finds himself mixed up in a plot right out of one of his novels. I think that's a great idea for a story. I think by this time Dario Argento was a well-oiled machine, so like there's a lot of skill behind the camera. It's visually stunning. It's got a great soundtrack, all the things that like Deep Red has. But it just doesn't have quite as much character as that movie did. And then the thing that really lets us down is that since this is a little bit later Giallo era, when you find out who the killer is, and then who the killer is, and then who the killer is, the whole thing just gets very convoluted and complicated to the point where it stops being surprising and you're just kind of waiting to find out what the real answer is because there's so many layers because they're trying to outdo what they've done before. So, solid movie from Dario Argento. Not my favorite, but still decent, and a fun, somewhat meta commentary on the Giallo film that I enjoyed. All right, being in the tease, these movies are coming. It's the Texas Chainsaw movies. First up, we've got Texas Chainsaw. So this is basically a direct follow-up to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. My understanding was that this was supposed to take place like the next day, but it turns out only the beginning of the movie takes place the next day, and then it kind of continues into its own continuity several decades later. This was easily the weakest of all of the Texas Chainsaw movies that I watched. This was filmed for 3D, so it's got a bunch of 3D schlock in it. And because it's completely inhabited by kind of typical 2000s teenage slash college girls, it just has this schlock element that makes it feel very un-Texas Chainsaw Massacre-like. It was a fun watch. I thought it was funny, but I didn't think it was good. Much better is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which I have seen before. Texas Chainsaw was new to me. This one I have seen. Of course, this is a masterpiece, much like Silence of the Lambs. There's so many things that have been said about this movie, and it's all true, basically. The thing is, like, every time I watch it, it surprises me on how intense it is. No matter how many times I see it, it still scares me. Absolutely unrelentingly punishing. Movie made basically 50 years ago now, almost. Still packs a huge punch. If you've never seen it, go watch it. I'm sure you've probably seen it. Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 2 is a movie that I think people either love it or hate it. I are on the side of love it. It's probably the movie I enjoy rewatching the most out of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre movies. It is also unrelenting, but it's also comedic and silly, which makes for this great recipe. If you like the Evil Dead 2 style of filmmaking, this might be the Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie for you. To be honest, I'm not entirely sure I could really explain the plot to this movie. It has that Gremlins 2 quality where it's just like throw everything and the kitchen sink into this movie and just make it big, ridiculous, over the top, and fun. So if that's the kind of movie you like, you'll enjoy it. If you don't like over the top, just skip it. It's not worth your time. Okay, and then last but not least, Texas Chainsaw Massacre: The Next Generation. This is technically Texas Chainsaw 4. I will preface this by saying I watched the director's cut of this. I didn't watch the theatrical cut. I was expecting this to be terrible. I was expecting it to be kind of an oddity because it has Renee Zellweger and Matthew McConaughey and two very early roles for them. But just based on kind of when it came out, like 95, like I picture like Halloween 6 level filmmaking. But once again, a Texas Chainsaw Massacre sequel that kind of surprised me. I thought that this was actually pretty good. I think that unlike Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3, this fits the Texas Chainsaw Massacre formula a little bit better, but does some similar things with it. This is directed by the co-writer of the original, so it kind of has that going for it. And the one thing I'll say that's really hokey about this is there's this tie-in to like the Illuminati which is a bit eye-rolling, and I think the movie is hurt by that because part of the scariness of Texas Chainsaw is that there is no rationale. Like, this is just something that happens because people at heart are insane. um, Whereas once you introduce the Illuminati to it, it has like a conspiracy element to it that doesn't quite work. But everything other than that was pretty intense. I thought Matthew McConaughey gives a great performance. There's some very interesting sort of sexual dynamics going on between all the different characters in this that made for a pretty interesting follow up to a franchise that I was expecting to be pretty over by the time I got to this movie. Ended up being kind of a hidden gem for me. I have one more marathon that I went through to go over with you guys, and then just a couple more movies after that. The marathon I did, which was actually a holdover from last year, because if you remember, I did all giant monster movies. One of the marathons I intended to do and didn't get to, that I ended up doing early in the month this year, was Tremors. So I've seen the first two Tremors. The rest of them were new to me. Obviously, Tremors 1, kind of a cult classic. Everybody kind of enjoys this movie. Not very scary. It fits the Halloween mold in the fact that it's giant monsters, but really at heart, it's kind of a lighthearted comedy. I found that as you get into the sequels, 2 is actually not too bad. It's not the best. It is made on a shoestring budget because it was done direct to video, so it's got like literally 20% the budget of the original, which was already low budget to begin with. But what's kind of cool about it is the first one was done by S.S. Wilson, Brent Braddock, and Ron Underwood. And then they each got to take turns directing their own. So this one is directed by the writer, S.S. Wilson. And even though he didn't have the budget, you do still kind of strike the tone of the original Tremors in this. And then in 3, you get one directed by Brett Braddock, who is the other co-writer of the original Tremors. And again, it fits the tone of the original. I think it all comes down to Burt Gummer, obviously, who's like the main through line of this franchise and how he's written, because it strikes a good tone where he's kind of a believable prepper type character. He's funny, but he's not played for laughs necessarily. He's just eccentric. Tremors 4, which was new to me, is also directed by S.S. Wilson, and this is the last of the films that they did. And in this, it's a prequel where, of course, Perfection, Nevada has descendants of all of the people who were in the original Tremors, of course. Michael Gross gets to play basically the exact opposite type of a character than he did in the original Tremors, where he's a guy who's like afraid of guns and is a rich kind of hoity-toity type guy, which made for a fun sequel. It wasn't the best, but it still felt very much in the zeitgeist of that first Tremors film. After you get out of 4, though, you get Tremors 5, Bloodlines, Tremors 6, A Cold Day in Hell, and then finally the fairly recent Tremors Shrieker Island. All of these ones are basically done by a new creative team. All of them are directed by Don Michael Paul, who has directed a lot of straight-to-video trash. He did a couple, or at least one of the Scorpion King sequels. That comes to mind. A couple other things like that. These ones I found to be pretty grueling. I did get through them all, and after I finished, I was like, geez, do I even say I watched these? Because they're just awful. It's kind of like Chucky, where, the first one, it hits that sweet spot between realism and absurdity. Whereas in these, the graboids are like played a little bit more realistic and they're a little bit more bombastic. Instead of the earth just kind of moving a little bit when they go through, the earth is like exploding out of the ground while they're coming in to attack. And it's like, am I supposed to be taking this seriously, or is this supposed to be a comedy? You just kind of don't know. And so for these last 3 movies, it just got really irritating. And then at the end of this one, spoilers, Burt Gummer gets killed off. I would love it if they kill this franchise off, but I have a feeling it will be back for more. Hopefully they don't bring John Heder back, because he was quite awful. Jamie Kennedy also in some of these. I would be just fine if he never came back. He is not a box office draw anymore. So please just let it die. Like, this is one of those franchises where it's time to let it die. I suspect that they will make more, or worse yet, they'll reboot it. Time will just tell. But I'll just say that I watched these, so you don't have to. You can stop after Tremors 4, or you could just stop after the original Tremors. That would probably be just fine too. Oh, and by the way, after watching these, that's what made me go back and watch Eight-Legged Freaks. Okay, almost done. 4 more movies left to talk about with you. First up, Tucker and Dale versus Evil. This was basically drawn out from the fact that I went through all the Texas Chainsaw Massacre movies. I had only seen 2 of those, and then I had seen this, but I sat down with my wife to watch it. She had never seen it. For those of you guys who haven't seen it, basically it's where a bunch of college kids go out into the woods and they're afraid of the stereotypical hillbilly serial killer stereotype that comes from Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And through a series of misunderstandings, Tucker and Dale, who are these 2 hillbillies, are believed to be these crazy chainsaw wielding serial killers. But it's all a big misunderstanding and hilarity ensues, basically. It's a great premise for a movie. Really, really funny. Also really gory and ridiculous, over the top. Just a fun movie. If you've never seen it, go check it out. I feel like this is one of those early Netflix titles where it was on streaming way back in the day, and it was kind of an early Netflix hit, even though it wasn't made for Netflix. It became a movie that people talked about on Netflix. Speaking of cult classics, I watched Trick or Treat, and this was a first view for me. I had never seen Trick or Treat before. It has been on my list forever. I love anthology horror movies. For example, I've got a whole bunch of Amicus movies right down there. And on top of it, I like Michael Dougherty as a director. I enjoyed Godzilla, King of the Monsters. I enjoyed Krampus. So this was a movie I had to get back and see, and I finally got around to it this year. Another movie where it's a cult classic for a reason, doesn't disappoint. You got Brian Cox in this as a crotchety old man. Not really what I think of as the traditional anthology horror movie where you have a very loose framing narrative that sets up each of the stories individually. Instead, they're actually kind of intercut together, and it's really just observing this town on Halloween night, and eventually you kind of hone in on each of the stories. So they are still separate stories, but they intertwine more, and they cut back and forth between them more. So really interesting little movie, very enjoyable, a movie I'm excited to revisit on a future Halloween for sure. Okay, so speaking of horror anthologies and Amicus films, I watched The Uncanny. If you like anthology movies, this is definitely a really fun one. It's completely themed around cats. Peter Cushing is a writer who's uncovered the secret history of how evil household cats are and what they do to people. And he presents his manuscript to his publisher, who looks it over, thinks it's all ridiculous, and Peter Cushing says, well, did you hear this story about cats? Or that story about cats? And before you know it, you have a whole bunch of stories about cats spanning around 100 years, in which they are revealed to be the secret masters of man that are basically serial killers in and of themselves. It's a silly movie. It's, nothing special necessarily, but if you like that Amicus mold of anthology horror, this fits right in. Peter Cushing gives a great little performance in it. Of all the anthology stories, the first one in this movie is probably my favorite, but all of them have a sort of surprisingly different tone to them, so it's kind of hard to pick. If you're into this type of movie, this is definitely one I would recommend. Okay, at long last, we have one final European horror movie. This is a movie that was released in the United States through Roger Corman, but technically it's a British film. I was spurred on to watch this after watching Mark of the Devil because that movie deals with witchcraft, and I thought, this is a movie where it's about witchcraft, it's a classic, and I haven't seen it. I need to add it to my list. And that is Witchfinder General, starring Vincent Price. If I were to rate this movie on like a grading system, I'd probably give it a B as opposed to like an A+. And the person that I watched it with actually said they didn't really like it. They gave it like a C as like competent. I think there's a lot to the zeitgeist of this movie where, the director was like in his 20s. He didn't get along with Vincent Price. He wanted another actor. he did admittedly get a great performance out of Vincent Price in this movie. And then as this, up and coming director in his 20s, doing better and better work, out of nowhere he dies shortly after this movie comes out. So like I can see where if this movie is more contemporary for you, that it would kind of elevate itself to the level of a cult classic. But for me, it just didn't quite grab me on that next level. I do think that the improvised ending, in which even though the hero saves the day at the end, they're clearly emotionally scarred from the whole experience, I think moved the level up a notch from where it kind of was up to that point. But some of the sort of more swashbuckling elements of this movie, to me, just didn't really work as well. It was interesting, but I don't know, it just didn't quite work for me. Maybe it's just what I was expecting, and I'll have to go back and rewatch it. I think overall, I was just expecting this to be better than Mark of the Devil, which surprised me how great it was. And so then when I went into this, maybe I just went in with too high of expectations too. I'm not sure. But all told, this is a very solid movie. If you haven't seen it, definitely worth watching. Don't kill me down in the comments if you think I'm completely crazy for only giving this one a B, because it is good. It just, again, not my favorite. So that wraps up all the movies I watched for Halloween this year. Thanks for sticking with me. I'm sure this video is going to end up being really long. I ended up talking more about them than I intended to. But thanks for sticking with it. So many movies to watch. I'll be honest, I'm pretty excited to take a break from horror movies and probably a break from movies in general and just sit down today and read a book or something. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hope you guys had a great Halloween, and thanks for watching.